Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Today we are working on Chapter 13, Section 1, Oregon Country. Now, some of the things that we'll be discussing today, you got a glimpse of yesterday in the introductory lesson. We talked about the push westward and this idea of it was America's destiny to own all of the land between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans and to then push forward and claim that land. Well, today, we're going to look at some of the reasons that people pushed into specifically the Oregon Country, and we'll define Oregon Country, and it's a specific section of what is now the United States and Canada, but I'm getting ahead of myself. And like always, there is an audio recording aspect to today's lesson, which you can use. Otherwise, let's keep moving along with our video recording by looking at our key terms for today. And our key terms are Oregon Country, mountain man, individualist, and in this case, a rugged individualist, rendezvous. I know it looks like it's rendezvous, but it's pronounced rendezvous, and the Oregon Trail. We will talk about all of these things today. But first, I like to start us off with a question, pretty much with every lesson, but today's question: why do people move? Why do some families pack up all of their lives, throw them in a U-Haul like we're looking at right now, and move to a completely new area? Is it for better jobs? Is it to try something new? There's thousands of different reasons, but no matter how many times you move, there are a few things that you need to overcome. When you're moving to a new area, it's meeting new people, maybe figuring out the customs of that area, even something as simple as finding out the good places to eat, and so on and so forth. Moving can be difficult and it can be scary, but imagine moving someplace where no one has really been yet. That was facing the people that we're going to be talking about today. Thousands of Americans packed up their lives, packed up all of their belongings, and moved to the wilderness on the complete other side of the country and faced many dangers along the way, along the Oregon Trail. Now, as we read through today's lesson, I have a chart that I want you to fill out, which is pictured here, and it will help you organize some of your details about the Oregon Trail. And I have a copy of the chart. You can either download this and fill it out by hand. You can fill it out in LibreOffice or Word. Whatever you choose, make sure that once everything is filled out, that you then submit the chart to me at the end of today's lesson, because that is how you will be receiving your grade for today's lesson. So each one of these sections of the chart has something specific that I want you to put in there. And by following along in today's lesson, you should be able to fill out the entire chart and use it as a study guide. All right, let's get into the lesson. So through the 1820s, Americans continued to move west and occupied a lot of the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. But we've talked about this, that people were moving west, but they kind of stopped at the Mississippi. And so farmers, as they pushed westward, as more people pushed into that land, they wanted to continue to push farther westward to get new farmland. And settlers had heard of an area between the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific Ocean known as the Oregon Country. And it includes present-day Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and parts of Wyoming, Montana, and Western Canada. And actually, we're looking at a picture right now of the Oregon Country, and you can see how it encompasses some of these states as well as part of Western Canada. Now, this area, especially along the Pacific coast, the area was very fertile and very, very good for farming. But as you moved inland from the Pacific coast, so as you moved a little bit eastward, there were vast forests all the way through to the Rocky Mountains. And these forests weren't very good for farming, obviously, but they did have a lot of fur-bearing animals, so trappers and traders tended to move into these areas to try and catch these animals and then trade the furs for profits. And between the Rockies and the Pacific coast was an area that was kind of barren and dry, a plateau. So nobody really claimed that land for farming or for trapping. So along the coast, fertile lands, great for farming. Between there were forests along the Rocky Mountains, great for fur-bearing animals, and then between that there was a plateau that wasn't really good for either, so no one really moved into that area. And in the early 1800s, this whole area of the Oregon Country was claimed by the United States, Great Britain, Russia, and Spain. But most of the people that settled in that area were from the United States and Great Britain, so Spain and Russia kind of withdrew their claims. Russia went farther north, and Spain stayed in the southern areas. So the United States and Great Britain agreed to occupy that region together and share the responsibilities in an agreement made in 1818. So remember this 1818 agreement. Keep that kind of back in the sticky part of your brain, because it's going to come up again in the very, very near future. And remember, 1818, we're not that far removed from the War of 1812, so how long do you think the United States and Great Britain are really going to agree to share that area? Now, don't forget, who was there first? Correct, Native American tribes had been there for centuries, but no one really took them into consideration with these land claims. And so our first video is going to kind of sum up the Oregon Country, its geography, and some of the reasons that settlers were drawn to this area.
The area once known as the Oregon Country was much bigger than what we know today as the state of Oregon. At one time, the Oregon Country was bounded on the east by the Rocky Mountains and by the Pacific Ocean on the west. It stretched north into present-day Vancouver, Canada, and south to California. The Oregon Country was a breathtaking sight. It had spectacular mountains, lush forests, rich land, and powerful rivers running through it. A great abundance of wildlife populated the land. Fish of all kinds filled the fresh waters, and the soil was rich and fertile from the abundant rainfall. Before the Europeans arrived, the territory was home to many Indian tribes. The native people of the West, including the Chinook and the Clatsop, lived near the shores of the Pacific and along the Columbia River. The tribes had their own languages and customs. They fished and hunted, both for themselves and as a means of trade. Furs, dried fish, oil, shells, and baskets were traded between tribes. The Shoshone lived farther inland in the Snake River Valley, though they roamed far and wide hunting buffalo. North of the Snake River Valley and west of the Rockies was the Plateau, which was home to the Nez Perce, Cayuse, Walla Walla, Wanapum, Coeur d'Alene, and Flathead tribes, among others. In time, the Indian way of life was changed forever by the arrival of newcomers from Europe and the lands to the east that became the United States. By the early 1800s, the British and Americans would be the first to hold claim to the Oregon Country. But at one time, there were numerous groups with interest in the territory. Russians traveled across the Bering Sea and built trading posts and forts, starting north in Alaska and south, almost as far as San Francisco. Spain built Catholic missions and forts up the Pacific coast in California, while French trappers pushed west from French Canada to explore and blaze new trails. England sent explorers along the Pacific coast to look for a possible Northwest Passage, a system of rivers that could connect them to the east. the dream of finding a Northwest Passage became an important goal for governments and explorers alike.
If the Northwest Passage did not exist as a sea-level corridor across the continent, maybe there still existed a way to get across the continent very quickly by sailing up some of these rivers and down the others. The Columbia River, the River of the West, was the last link.
Even though they never found a Northwest Passage, the explorations of the territory still proved beneficial to the fur trading interests of the British and the Americans. Both the British and American governments made claims on the Oregon Territory based upon discoveries made by their explorers.
The first explorer in 1776 was Captain James Cook. He established a base for the British in Vancouver Island in what's now British Columbia in Canada. The second one was Captain Robert Gray. He was American, and what he did was he discovered the mouth of the Columbia River, opening trade routes. The third one was Alexander Mackenzie. He was the first one to make an overland passage from the Pacific Ocean through the Rocky Mountains.
Even more importantly, Lewis and Clark traversed the landscape during their investigation of the territories acquired in the Louisiana Purchase, reaching the Pacific Ocean in late 1805. These early claims meant nothing unless they could be backed up with settlements and protected by legal documentation. Both the Americans and the British strengthened their claims on Oregon through treaties with other countries. France, with the Louisiana Purchase, ceded to the United States their claims on Oregon. In the Florida Purchase Treaty of 1813, the Spanish gave up their right to claim the Oregon Territory as an extension of Spanish-controlled California. The American and British political interests in the Northwest Territory began to clash by late 1810. Rather than taking up arms with one another, the countries sought a compromise that would satisfy both sides. In 1818, they signed a treaty in which they agreed to occupy the Oregon country together for 10 years. After that period, the agreement would automatically be renewed unless either nation gave a year's notice that they intended to end their participation in the treaty.
Now, at first, only a few Europeans and Americans traveled to the Oregon country, and most of them were fur traders. Furs could be sold for huge profits in China, so traders would stop in the Oregon country on their way to China in order to trade. But only a handful actually settled in Oregon. And these men, these mountain men, were adventurous men with awesome beards who hiked through the region's vast frontiers in search of animals and really lived off the land. And they were admired, especially back east, for being rugged individualists because they followed their own independent course in life. They made clothes out of animal skins, grew long beards, and carried pistols and tomahawks from their belts. And there was actually a lot of money to be made in fur trapping, but it was a very dangerous profession. Fur trappers had to learn to live off the land and survive those long and very harsh winters. And in addition to the weather, there were there were bears and other animals that they had to contend with. And food itself could become very, very scarce. Trappers would spend their winters generally with Native Americans, and they would learn trapping and survival skills from these tribes. And our next video is going to talk about some of the dangers that fur trappers and these rugged individualists had to endure.
Once in the mountains, a reckless new breed of man evolved. They called themselves free trappers or mountain men. In the wilderness, these men cast off the constraints of civilization and reverted to a freer, more primitive lifestyle. No man or government was their master, and they went where and when they pleased. These men were loners, coming together only once or twice a year to trade goods. As an outgrowth of this free-ranging lifestyle, the mountain men became the early explorers and trailblazers of the western United States. Eventually, they discovered the easiest way to the Pacific, not by river, as people had thought, but overland through the South Pass. Here's how one person described this wary new pioneer.
Habitual watchfulness destroys every frivolity of mind and action. They seldom smile. The expression on their countenance is watchful, solemn, and determined. They ride and walk like men who have so long been exposed to the bullet and the arrow that fear finds within them no resting place.
Their physical appearance was often quite interesting. Their unkempt hair hung to their shoulders and their faces were hidden by beards. Their dress was highly colorful and ornamented. They carried pistols, scalping knives in leather sheaths, and for their rifles they carried bullets and gunpowder in powder horns. A person would have been well advised to appreciate the mountain men from a distance, since they rarely bathed and removed their clothes only when they were ready to be thrown away. The mountain men often took on the mannerisms and gestures of the Native American Indians they encountered in the mountains. They even developed their own language.
And then I wandered into his liver up to Green River.
Running meat on foot because a painter at his horse. Anyways, you
One shot in their crowd, pumpkin.
Be it for a tater if old John didn't throw a buffer right the first whack. Slickest shooting you ever seen.
Slide, you corn-cracking, yabbering yahoo.
Pass that old Virginia down here.
Mountain men grew calloused about their daily brushes with danger. Like many people living close to nature, the mountain men had little regard for or fear of death, their own or any other living creatures. Of the dangers the mountain men faced, 3 were most formidable. Grizzly bears, it is said, roamed the Rocky Mountains in huge numbers and were a constant threat. The mountain men viewed most of the native inhabitants, particularly the Blackfoot tribe, as their enemy. Certainly many mountain men died at the hands of Indians, just as many Indians were killed by mountain men. However, at times trading took place between the two groups. In fact, mountain men sometimes hired Indians to trap for them, and often they took Indian wives. The third danger was winter, with its relentless storms. Prolonged periods of cold and snow could lead to freezing and starvation, a grim death that took many lives. It is said that 1 of every 5 mountain men died in the wilderness. Many simply vanished and were never heard from again.
So if the trappers could survive the winter, and let's hope that they did, once they survived the winter, they would march out in the spring to sell their furs, and they would meet a spot that had been determined beforehand, known as a rendezvous, or rendezvous point. And for a while, beaver hats especially were very popular in the eastern United States and in Europe, so the furs would get trappers a very large profit. But like most things, once the hats went out of style, the trappers had to figure out new ways to make money using the skills that they had developed. And it was these survival and navigation skills that would provide many mountain men with a new profession as trail guides. These men had explored many parts of the West in search of furs and just to try and survive. And they followed Indian trails through the passes in the Rocky Mountains. So they would use this knowledge of these trails to lead settlers through the mountains and help them to learn how to survive this new environment. And the picture that we've been looking at it's the 6 steps that were needed to make a beaver hat. So step one is up here in the corner, and then as we move around the table, you can see a beaver hat going from a pelt all the way to a finished product. So up until now, we've been talking about people that would pretty much settle temporarily in the area, but the first white Americans to permanently settle the Oregon Country were missionaries who sought to convert the Native American tribes living in the area to Christianity. Again, these were the first white Americans to permanently settle in the Oregon Country. Some were successful, but others only really succeeded in bringing diseases to the natives that their immune systems weren't accustomed to. But as more and more settlers joined, more diseases unfortunately came with them. So they came out with good intentions, but the people living in this area didn't have the immune systems developed to handle these diseases that many of the missionaries didn't even know that they had. And even though they came with seemingly good intentions, they were blamed for the deaths of many, especially of the Cayuse Indians. And after measles broke out in their villages amongst the Indian children, and in revenge, a lot of the missionaries were killed. But despite the killings and despite a lot of the other dangers, many more pioneers set out west for Oregon because they were attracted by these tales of soil that was so rich it could grow wheat that was taller than a man and turnips that were 5 feet around. So these tales of this wonderful soil led to a race to Oregon known as Oregon Fever. And as Oregon Fever spread, pioneers clogged the trails west, and beginning in 1843, trips left every spring following a route known as the Oregon Trail. And when I think of the Oregon Trail, I think of this awesome old video game that I used to play when I was in school. And as you can see, video games have come a long way since Mr. Huebner was but a lad. And some of the hardships waiting for the pioneers on the trail were going to be discussed in our next video.
In 1843, the third year of John Tyler's presidency, the land directly north of Mexican California was called the Oregon Country. This was a vast, sparsely populated region that stretched from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean and extended as far as the southern border of Russian Alaska. At that time, the Oregon Country was still under the joint control of Great Britain and the United States. Back then, Britain dominated the region and maintained a huge fur trading outpost there called Fort Vancouver on the banks of the Columbia River. Their outpost, which was regularly visited by trading ships, was operated by the powerful Hudson's Bay Company of London. But British dominance of the region was about to end. For just to the south of Fort Vancouver lay the fertile valley of the Willamette River, where tiny groups of whites had started to settle and where many others would soon follow. 1843 was the year an American missionary led a great migration of 1,000 pioneers in a wagon train west from Independence, Missouri, to the Oregon Country, along what came to be called the Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail was a rough, rutted track, about 2,000 miles, or 3,200 kilometers long, the longest of the great overland routes used in the westward expansion of the United States. Crossing it required making a difficult journey of 6 months. Most pioneers traveled in covered wagons, but some walked or even pushed wheelbarrows full of their belongings. Back in the 1840s, the pioneers referred to most of the land they passed over on the Oregon Trail as the Great American Desert, because they did not think that such dry, barren land could ever be farmed. Over the years, the Oregon Trail came to be dotted with forts. The biggest one was Fort Laramie in today's state of Wyoming. Here the pioneers could rest up in safety and even obtained many needed supplies at the fort's store before they continued on with their long journey west. Not far from Fort Laramie, it is still possible to see where the pioneers carved their names in the rocks as a lasting reminder that they had passed by. In the present-day state of Idaho, the Oregon Trail branched. The southern branch, called the California Trail, ended at Sutter's Fort in Sacramento. The northern branch continued on toward Fort Vancouver. When the pioneers on the Oregon Trail finally reached the deep rocky gorge of the Columbia River, they knew they were close to their goal. Here the wagons were often placed on rafts and floated down to Fort Vancouver. And from there, the rich land of the Willamette Valley was just a short distance away.
The trail itself started in a town called Independence, Missouri, and pioneers would set out no later than May so that they would be able to cross the Rocky Mountains before the snowstorms hit. So imagine that, planning your trip, knowing that you would have to plan months and months in advance to leave in order to be able to get to your destination before bad weather. And families of pioneers would organize themselves into wagon trains and elect a leader to take charge of the group. Now, to avoid the weather, pioneers had to cross 2,000 miles in under 5 months, and in 1840, traveling 15 miles a day was considered to be making really good time. And that seems very slow because it is very slow. The last time I drove to visit my hometown of Uniontown, the 262-mile trip from Allentown to Uniontown took me about 4 hours. So, looking here at our lovely state of Pennsylvania, if I was to do this same exact trip using a wagon train, it would have taken about 18 days. So much for a trip home. Even the life on the trail itself was very difficult. Families would wake up at dawn and were generally on the trail by 6 a.m. There would be a very short stop for lunch, and then they would be back on the trail till about 6 or 7 at night. So basically you're on the trail for 12 to 13 hours a day. And at night, everyone would put the wagons in a circle to keep the cattle from wandering away, and B, to provide a defense in case of wild animals and the occasional Native American attack. Now, most of the Native Americans on the trail were friendly and would trade with the settlers, and the food that they got from the Native Americans was welcomed. The settlers were very, very grateful for it. But depending on where the settlers were on the trail, they would have more goods to trade with these Native American tribes. And once the settlers hit the Rocky Mountains, many of the items that they had were discarded so that they could lighten the wagons in order to make it over the mountains. And other dangers that they faced were high rivers, blistering summer heat, and early snows that could potentially block the very important mountain passes. Oh, and also, diseases, because medicine was kind of in short supply at that time as well. So life on the wagon train was not easy. But despite all of these obstacles, despite diseases, animal attacks, Native American attacks, harsh weather, flooding rivers, between 1840 and 1860, over 50,000 people reached Oregon, and the tracks from the wagon wheels cut so deep into the plains that in some areas they can actually still be seen today. And this is the picture that we're looking at is part of the Oregon Trail as it looks today. By the 1840s, Americans in the Oregon country far outnumbered the British. And as we mentioned at the beginning of this lesson, both countries had agreed in 1818 to occupy the area jointly. But since there were so many more Americans living there, the settlers wanted the United States alone to control it, because most of the settlers were Americans. They wanted to be a part of America. And in the upcoming sections, we're going to discuss how this territory officially became a part of the United States and of Canada. So to kind of wrap it all up, life on the trail can be broken down into about 4 areas. Relations with Native Americans, they would trade for food, and occasionally there would be attacks, but for the most part, the relationship with Native Americans was symbiotic. They helped each other out. There were hardships, heavy gear, rough trails, harsh weather, disease. The distance, it was about 2,000 miles from Independence, Missouri to the Oregon country. And then the harsh daily routine, up at dawn, brief meal at noon, stop overnight, and corral all the animals in to keep them from running away. So life on the trail can be summed up with relations with Native Americans, there were hardships, the distance, and the daily routine. Which brings us to the assignment. Bam, here's our assignment. I showed you a picture of this before. This is our Oregon country chart, and I want you to list out 3 things about the land of the Oregon country. What was land like along the Pacific coast, along the Rocky Mountains, and then the plateau in between. The climate, the journey to Oregon, so some of the things that they had to face in the hardships that were faced on the way to Oregon. Who traveled there, what types of people, different people groups that traveled to Oregon, and some of the things that people could do once they were in the Oregon country. Now, there's a lot of different answers that you can be putting in. There's a couple of different ways that you can do this as well, so whichever way you choose, please make sure that every section of the chart is filled out and complete, and so that I can give you credit. So this is a pretty easy way to earn 15 points in our class today. But all right, that is all that I wanted to discuss today, and tomorrow we're going to pick up talking about the Oregon country and eventually how that would become a part of the United States. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself.